Nobody outside Amato's recognized the man crouched under the awning that night. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow, a coat that didn't fit him, and 6 nights of cold soaked into his skin. When the door swung open and 3 well-dressed men came out laughing, one of them looked down and said, "This doorway's paid for. Go find somewhere else to freeze." Another one lifted a piece of warm bread out of a takeout bag, held it up until the old man's eyes followed it, then dropped it into the storm drain. "There you go. Help yourself." They were still laughing when the car pulled away. The man didn't reach for the drain. He stood up slowly and made himself straight, the way a person does when a straight back is the only thing he's got left. Across the street, a florist stopped and stared. A delivery driver raised his phone and started filming, and not one of them had any idea what they were looking at. Then a young woman came up the block from the shelter line, 27 years old, brown hair pulled back in a hurry, a child's mitten sticking out of her coat pocket. She was carrying 1 loaf of bread. It was the last food she and her daughter had, and payday wasn't until Thursday. She sat down on the freezing step beside him, tore that loaf in half, and handed him the bigger piece. "Careful," she said. "It's a day old, so it fights back." He looked at it for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" She just shrugged. "Because you looked hungry, and I've been hungry." What she didn't know was that the man eating her bread had signed a document that morning with 1 line left blank, the line where a name was supposed to go, and he'd just found it. If stories about ordinary courage move you, take a second to hit like and share this with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribing helps these stories reach the people they're meant for. Now let's go back to that cold sidewalk in South Philadelphia and find out who was really sitting there. A few weeks before that night on the porch, the nameless man on the sidewalk was still Salvatore Amato, and he sat in the back room of a bakery on Passyunk Avenue, where, for 40 years, no one had ever dared to position a chair with its back to the door. Neither had he. His chair stood against the wall, always against the wall, and anyone who entered that room had to pass beneath his gaze before finding a place to sit. That night, the man who walked in was a contractor named Dale Bergstrom, a large man with a heavy watch on his wrist, who smiled before he had even offered a greeting. He sat down, smoothed the creases in his jacket, and said that the delays at the low-income housing development were because of the weather, the cost of materials, and all manner of things beyond his control. Sal didn't interrupt him. He poured the man a glass of liquor, pushed it across the table, then poured one for himself. Bergstrom went on talking for a while, speaking faster with every passing moment, because silence in that room wasn't like silence anywhere else. When he finally stopped, Sal set his glass on the table without taking a drink and asked how his daughter had been lately. Bergstrom stared at him, stunned for a beat. Sal continued in an even voice, saying that he'd heard the girl had transferred to a school across the river in the fall, that he'd heard they had an excellent music program there, and that a child fortunate enough to receive proper piano lessons was a lucky child indeed. He said it in precisely the tone a person might use to inquire about someone's health. The color slowly drained from Bergstrom's face, not because anyone had threatened him, but because he understood that the man sitting across from him had known where his daughter went to school for a long time, and had merely chosen that day to say it aloud. Sal leaned forward, and his voice grew softer. Everyone who knew him understood that this was the worst possible sign. The angrier he became, the quieter his voice grew. He said the missing money wasn't his, that it belonged to the people who would one day sleep in the apartments that had never been built, and that there were elderly women who had submitted housing applications the previous winter and were still waiting. Then, he gave Bergstrom until the end of the week. He didn't say what he would do if the man failed to repay it. He only said that afterward, he wouldn't come looking for him, no one would knock on the door of his home, and nothing at all would happen. He would simply make one telephone call, and beginning the next day, the name Bergstrom wouldn't be able to sign a single thing in that city again. Not a contract, not a permit, not even a loan for a car. He said there were ways to erase a man from the map without ever laying a hand on him, and he'd spent his entire life learning them. Bergstrom opened his mouth, preparing to say something about his family, his circumstances, and how he would make the necessary arrangements. Sal extended one hand, placed it against the base of his glass, and turned it halfway around on the tabletop. That was all. The 2 men standing at the entrance immediately opened the door. Bergstrom understood. He rose and walked out with both hands trembling so violently that he couldn't fasten the buttons of his coat. No one raised his voice. No one touched anyone. In that room, the glass spoke for them all, and all of South Philadelphia could read that language. When the door closed, Sal remained alone with his untouched liquor. Out there in the city, the number of people who had ever seen his face could probably be counted on one hand. People knew the Amato name. They knew the restaurants, the transportation company, the family foundation, and the bronze plaques mounted on the walls of relief centers. But the face captured by the press, the face shaking hands with politicians at fundraising dinners, the smiling face on the front page of the business section, belonged to Rocco. His cousin, the man who stepped forward to receive every spotlight, and the man who, through all those years, had never once been allowed to hold the real key. Sal had arranged it that way from the beginning, and he believed it was how he kept the family safe. He had no idea that every photograph Rocco posed for, every time he was called the boss while owning nothing in truth, had been slowly accumulating into something very quiet inside that man's chest. Sal left the bakery that night, and on his way home, he believed he'd just settled the most important matter of the week. He didn't know that only a few days later, while clearing out his mother's room, he would find something that made everything he'd just done seem pitifully small. About 20 blocks from the bakery on Passyunk Avenue, at around the same time, another line of people stretched outside the doors of Mrs. Vera Lindquist's relief center, and Willa Marsh stood near the end of it with her daughter clutching the hem of her coat. That night was colder than any other night that week. She had planned carefully and arrived earlier than usual, but she still hadn't come early enough. When Mrs. Vera stepped onto the porch with her ledger in hand and announced that there was exactly one bed left, Willa raised her hand to call out. Then she turned and looked behind her. An elderly woman with silver hair and a stooped back stood there, clutching a plastic bag in both hands and trembling so badly that the bag shook with her. Willa lowered her hand. She stepped aside, gently touched the old woman's elbow, and told her to go ahead, that she and her daughter were used to sitting outside. Mrs. Vera looked at her for a moment with the gaze of a woman who had stood in that doorway far too long not to understand what had just happened. Then she said nothing. She simply wrote the elderly woman's name in the ledger and gave Willa 2 blankets instead of 1. Mother and daughter settled into a sheltered corner of the porch, where a brick wall blocked the wind and a yellow light hung overhead. Willa spread 1 blanket beneath them, took off her coat and wrapped it around the little girl's legs, then drew her child into her arms. Junie was 6 years old, and Junie didn't ask why. She never did. To her, sitting on the porch meant she was allowed to stay up late, and staying up late was always fun. She looked up and said, "Let's play the bus counting game, Mama." Willa nodded. It was a game they had invented during the summer, and the rules were very simple. A blue bus was worth 1 point. A white bus was worth 2. And a bus filled with people going to work the night shift was worth 5 points. And they had to wave at it. Junie kept winning because she cheated, and Willa let her. A nearly empty bus drove past, and the driver saw the 2 of them sitting on the porch and gave them a short greeting with his horn. Junie laughed so loudly that she had to cover her mouth with both hands, afraid she might wake someone. When the game began to lose its excitement, she took a pad of paper and several crayons from her backpack, the ones Mrs. Vera had given her the previous week, lay on her stomach across the blanket, propped herself up on her elbows, and began to draw. Willa asked what she was drawing. Junie said she was drawing her mother. She worked with great seriousness, the tip of her tongue peeking from one corner of her mouth, as she colored the same place again and again. After a while, she held up the sheet of paper for her mother to see. In the picture, a brown-haired woman stood tall and straight, wearing a long white uniform with a rounded collar and sleeves that reached past her elbows. On her chest was a small streak of blue that Junie explained was her name badge. She said this was Mama working at the hospital. She said her teacher had told her that a hospital was a place where people helped other people get well, and Mama could certainly do that because Mama was the best at everything. Willa held the drawing in her hands and sat in silence for a very long time. She didn't tell her daughter that the uniform was real, that it had once hung inside her locker on the 4th floor of the pediatric intensive care unit, that she'd once worn it through night shifts so long that when she came home, she couldn't lift her arms high enough to wash her hair, or that one night she had taken it off and had never been allowed to wear it again. She didn't tell her, because doing so would require an explanation, and an explanation would make a 6-year-old child understand that her mother had lost something. Willa would rather let her believe that Mama was still the woman in the picture. She merely kissed her daughter's hair and said, "I love this picture very much. Will you finish it for me tomorrow?" Junie yawned, nodded, and fell asleep in her mother's arms with a crayon still clutched in her hand. Willa sat upright against the brick wall, holding her daughter with one arm and the drawing with the other, and she remained that way until morning. 3 days after the night at the bakery, Salvatore Amato did something he had been postponing since the winter his mother died. He went up to the 3rd floor, opened the door to her room, and began clearing it out. The room remained exactly as it had been on the day she lay down for the last time, except that a thin layer of dust now covered everything. He worked slowly, one drawer at a time, placing dresses into boxes, folding scarves, and taking photographs down from the walls. In the bottom drawer of a cabinet, he found a cardboard box filled with letters she had kept through all those years. Letters from relatives in the old country, Christmas cards, old bills, things no one read anymore. He was about to carry the entire box away. Then he saw it. A white envelope that had faded to a pale yellow lay among the papers, and what made him stop wasn't the color of the paper, but the edge of the envelope. It was still intact. No one had opened it. The writing on the front belonged to a stranger. The letters were rounded and slightly slanted, the kind of handwriting used by someone accustomed to taking notes quickly. The address bore the correct house number and the correct street name. The postmark was from 3 winters earlier. Sal sat on the edge of his mother's bed with the envelope in his hands, and it took him a long while to tear it open. Inside was a single handwritten sheet of paper, and it wasn't long. The writer introduced herself as a nurse who worked the night shift in the emergency department of a hospital in the city. She wrote that she was very sorry to deliver the news in a letter, that she had tried to find a telephone number but couldn't, and that this address was the only one she had been able to locate among the patient's belongings. Then she wrote the name, Renzo. She wrote that he had been brought in near dawn, that the doctors had done everything they could, and that he had died that night. She wrote that no one had come to claim him. In the final sentence of the letter, she wrote that she didn't know whether the family would want to hear this, but she believed they should know that he hadn't been lying there alone. Sal read the letter 3 times. Then he sat on the floor with his back against the side of the bed and remained there until darkness had completely fallen. What filled his mind wasn't grief, not yet, but an equation that refused to yield an answer. The letter had come to this address. It had been inside this house for 3 winters. Through those 3 winters, he had continued eating dinner downstairs, signing contracts, attending fundraising events, and living every day of his life to its fullest, without ever knowing that his younger brother had died in an emergency room less than 15 minutes away by car. Someone had held this envelope in their hands. Someone had decided that it didn't need to be opened. The following morning, he went for the heart examination he had postponed 3 times. He sat in Dr. Holloway's office with his shirt unbuttoned and the electrode wires still attached to his chest, listening as the doctor spoke a name he had heard only once before in his life, the name that had been uttered in another room long ago, when his father lay on a table, and the entire family had been called inside. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Hereditary. Dr. Holloway explained that the walls of the heart muscle grew abnormally thick, that some people carried the condition throughout their lives without ever knowing it until it was too late, that it was more common than most people realized, and most frequently went undetected in those who never underwent screening, simply because they didn't have the time, didn't have insurance, or had never been told that they should be examined. Sal sat in silence and listened to everything. He didn't ask how much time he had left. He didn't ask what percentage chance he had of surviving. Didn't ask whether surgery was possible. Didn't ask any of the questions people usually asked in that room. He merely looked down at his 2 hands, then raised his eyes and asked Dr. Holloway a single question, whether his younger brother had ever been examined for this condition. Dr. Holloway paused. He said that if the man had never gone to a medical facility for screening, then he almost certainly hadn't been. Sal nodded slowly. He buttoned his shirt again, thanked the doctor, and walked out into the hospital corridor with the letter folded into quarters inside his breast pocket, directly above the heart his father had left him, the heart he had just realized he, too, had passed on to his younger brother, and which no one in their family had ever thought to look for. 1 week after the examination, Sal summoned the council to the back room of the bakery. 3 old men arrived, each representing a family that had shared a table with his father since the days when the entire neighborhood still had no streetlights, and they came wearing the expressions of men who knew something had happened but hadn't yet guessed what it was. Sal didn't pour any liquor. He spoke at once. He said he was stepping away. He said the port route would be closed, every active contract would be settled according to its existing terms, and every asset belonging to him would be transferred to the Amato Foundation. When he had finished, he sat in silence and waited. The man in the middle, the smallest and oldest of the three, placed both hands on the table and said the boy must be ill. Sal said he was ill. No one laughed. The man on the left asked whether he understood what he'd just said. Whether he understood that this wasn't a table where a man could sit down and then rise and go home, that in 40 years no one had ever walked out of this room through the front door, and that those who had tried had all left by another way. Sal said he understood. He said he wasn't asking anyone's permission. He had come only to inform them. Then he placed 3 sets of documents on the table, each addressing a separate matter, and presented them in the steady voice of a man reading the minutes of a meeting, not a man removing his own armor in the middle of a room filled with knives. First, the family's enforcement arm would be dissolved. Everyone belonging to that division would receive enough money either to transfer into the transportation company or leave entirely, and beginning the following month, no one would take orders directly from him anymore. Second, the Amato Foundation would be separated completely in legal terms. Its assets would stand alone, its accounts would be separate, its audits would be independent, and not even Sal would be allowed to withdraw a single dollar for personal use. There would be no exceptions and no backdoors. Third, the day-to-day management of the entire legitimate business operation would pass to a board composed of longtime employees, and Sal would retain only the role of shareholder. He signed every page slowly, then slid them across to the lawyer Meredith Falk, who sat at the end of the table to notarize them. Mrs. Falk took the pen, smiled, and said this was the right thing to do, that she had been waiting a long time for this day. The 3 old men looked at one another. No one tried to stop him. At last, the man in the middle merely said that if Sal wanted to leave through the front door, then he could go, but he should remember that when he released his hold on this table, the table wouldn't disappear. It would simply have someone new sitting at it. Sal placed his hand against the base of his glass and turned it halfway around. The meeting was over. That night, he returned home and completed one final task. He sat in his study, opened the safe, and signed a document he had commissioned the previous week. A document containing exactly 1 blank line, the line where the name of his heir was supposed to be written. He picked up the pen, then set it down again. He had a cousin and a younger sister, and he couldn't bring himself to write either of their names. Then he did something the people around him would later call madness. He took off his watch, removed his ring, placed his telephone in a drawer, and locked it. He put on the oldest clothes he could find in the gardener's closet. He told no one. He carried only the letter folded into quarters in his breast pocket, and a single thought, that his younger brother had spent his final winter somewhere in this city, and Sal would find that place. He would walk there on foot. He would go as a man who had nothing, because that was the only way people would be willing to speak to him. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he walked out through the rear gate. Only one person saw him leave. Wendell Pruitt stood inside the guardhouse, an old man who had worked at that gate since before Sal knew how to tie his own shoes, and he didn't ask a single question. He merely looked Sal up and down, saw the thin shirt clinging to his employer's body, then turned back into the guardhouse, brought out his own old canvas coat, faded with age and worn through at both elbows, and passed it between the bars of the gate. Sal took it. Wendell said, "Don't sleep where the wind can reach you, young master." Then he opened the gate and closed it softly behind Sal, as if he were afraid of waking the entire house sleeping beyond it. The first night was the longest night of Salvatore Amato's life, and he had lived through several nights worth remembering. He slept beneath an overpass near Delaware Avenue, wrapped in Wendell's canvas coat, and near dawn he came to understand something no one in his family had ever known, that the cold on the street didn't come from the air but from the ground. It crept upward through the back, through the hips, through every bone of the spine, and no layer of clothing could keep it out. By morning, he couldn't stand upright at first, but what stunned him even more than the cold was the way people looked at him. They didn't look at him at all. People heading to the morning shift passed him as they would pass a trash can, their eyes sliding away before they could make contact, and he understood that for all those years, he had believed the most terrifying thing was to be feared. It wasn't. The most terrifying thing was to disappear while still breathing. He walked for 6 days. He went to every shelter, every church that served meals, every warming center that opened at night, and everywhere he went, he asked to see the register of those who had slept there. They wouldn't let him see it, of course. He was a ragged old man asking about a stranger, so he changed his approach. He stayed. He waited. He questioned the people standing in line beside him. He spoke Renzo's name aloud and studied every face to see whether it stirred even the faintest trace of recognition. None of them did. One person said the name sounded familiar, then shook his head and said he must have been mistaken. Another said that everyone there had 3 or 4 names, that the one written in the register was the real one, although sometimes the name in the register was the greatest lie of all. By the 4th day, Sal had memorized the road from the overpass to the church on Snyder Street, and he still hadn't found a single line, a single signature, or a single trace of his younger brother in the city where they had both been born. But he found something else, and it hurt him in a way for which he had no name. The people who gave him the most during those 6 days were all people who had the least. At the end of each day, a woman who sold sandwiches on a street corner poured the coffee left in her pot into a cup for him, and she never once asked his name. A young man returning from a car wash, his feet still wet, pressed a bill folded into quarters into Sal's hand and walked away without looking back. A man with one leg who slept beside him on the 5th night pulled his piece of cardboard over to shield Sal from the wind without saying a word. Meanwhile, throughout those 6 days, he received nothing from anyone who looked like the people who had always sat at his table. On the 5th day, he reached Mrs. Vera Lindquist's center. He stood in line for soup, and when his turn came, he looked up and met the eyes of the woman standing behind the pot. Mrs. Vera looked at him. She ladled out the soup and handed him the bowl, and her hand didn't tremble, but she studied him one moment longer than she had studied the person before him or the person behind him. Only one moment. Then she called for the next person. Sal carried his bowl of soup onto the porch and sat down, telling himself that he had imagined it. That night, he remained there until late, and then he saw something that made him set his bowl aside. Mrs. Vera came onto the porch with her ledger, counted once more, then told the people still standing outside that there were no beds left for the night. She asked them to return the following morning, and said there would be hot coffee beginning at 6 o'clock. She spoke in the voice of someone who had been forced to say those words far too many times. Some people left. Others remained sitting on the porch, and directly above her head, mounted on the brick wall beside the entrance, was a bronze plaque polished to a gleam, engraved with the words that this center had been built through contributions from the Amato Foundation. Sal sat beneath the plaque bearing his family's name, eating a bowl of soup paid for with his own money, and counted the people who had to turn away because there was nowhere left for them to sleep. As Sal sat on the porch eating his soup beneath the Amato Foundation plaque, Willa watched him from a few paces away. She had noticed him 3 days earlier not because of his ragged clothes, but because of his left hand. He had a habit of cupping his left hand and pressing it lightly against his ribcage, just beneath his chest. Willa had seen that posture exactly once before in her life, during a night shift 3 winters ago, when a nameless young man had been brought into the emergency room. Right after sharing her loaf of bread with him, Willa couldn't help but ask where it hurt. He insisted nothing hurt, but Willa knew better. She reached out, placed 2 fingers against his wrist, and then his neck, counting his pulse in silence. "There's a skip in your heartbeat," she warned him quietly. "I once watched a man much younger than you die because of that exact same rhythm. You need to go to a clinic." Sal fell silent, but before he could answer, a sudden commotion broke out at the end of the shelter line. A man collapsed onto the concrete, his body stiffening into violent convulsions. Without a second thought, despite her suspended medical license and the legal risks, Willa rushed forward and dropped to her knees. She slipped her coat under the man's head, turned him onto his side to clear his airway, and managed the seizure with calm, experienced precision until the ambulance arrived. When it was over, Willa retreated to a dark corner of the porch, her hands trembling violently. She never realized that in the middle of the dispersing crowd, the ragged man she had just helped stood perfectly still, watching her. One question formed with sudden clarity in Salvatore Amato's mind. Who was this woman? That night, Sal returned home through the rear gate, the same gate through which he had left, and Wendell opened it for him without saying a word. He merely looked him up and down once, then nodded as though his employer had just gone out to buy cigarettes. Sal went upstairs and stood beneath the hot water for a very long time, and when he stepped out, he stared at himself in the mirror for a while before he recognized the man looking back. He shaved. He put on a white shirt and a charcoal suit jacket. He opened the safe, took out his watch, and fastened it around his wrist, then finally put on the ring he had removed at 4 o'clock that morning. It was looser than he remembered. 6 days on the street had taken something from him that could be measured by the size of a ring. He took the letter, folded into quarters, slipped it into the breast pocket of his jacket, then went downstairs. There was light in the private dining room, and voices came from within. He stood in the hallway and listened for a while. Rocco was talking about the need to think ahead, the need for someone to step forward and take responsibility, and how they couldn't leave everything hanging in uncertainty any longer. Nadia's voice answered with a question he couldn't quite make out, and she sounded tired. The third voice belonged to the lawyer Meredith Falk, steady and precise as she read from a list. Sal pushed open the door and walked in. Rocco turned first, and for the smallest fraction of a second, before his face could rearrange itself into something appropriate, Sal saw it. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was the look of something falling. Then Rocco sprang to his feet, called Sal's name, asked where he'd been all week, and said the entire family had thought he was dead. Nadia couldn't speak at all. She was holding a glass of wine, and it slipped from her fingers, fell to the stone floor, and shattered with one sharp, clean sound. No one bent down to pick it up. Mrs. Falk slowly closed the file in front of her and smiled, saying how fortunate it was that he had returned. Sal didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table with both hands resting on the back of a chair, and he spoke in the quiet voice that everyone who had ever sat in the back room of the bakery knew very well. He said he had been hungry that week. He said he'd slept on the street for 6 nights, and throughout those 6 nights, inside this very house, no one had given him so much as a piece of bread because no one had cared enough to look for him. He said that out there, a woman who had nothing had broken her last portion of food in half and given him the larger share. Rocco gave a short laugh and said, "Sal, why would you do something like that? If you wanted to test someone's loyalty, you could have simply said so. Everyone in this family would do anything for you." Sal looked at him. He said he hadn't gone out to test anyone's loyalty. Then he reached into his breast pocket, took out the yellowed envelope, unfolded it, and placed it on the table between the 3 of them. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't explain. He merely said that he had gone looking for a body no one had come to claim. Nadia leaned forward to look at the envelope, frowning like someone who still didn't understand. Mrs. Falk remained sitting upright, her expression unchanged, but her hand had gone perfectly still on top of the file. Rocco, however, stared at that envelope longer than a man seeing it for the first time should have. The color slowly drained from his face, rising from the bottom upward, and he tried to speak, but the words wouldn't leave his throat. Sal saw everything. He tapped one finger against the envelope once, very softly. He said the letter had been sent to this address and had remained inside this house for 3 winters without being opened. He said a letter didn't lose itself inside the drawer of a dead woman. Someone had held it in their hands. Someone had decided that the news inside wasn't worth letting him know. Then he looked at each of the 3 faces in the room, one after another, and said he would find out who that person was. Early the following morning, Rocco knocked on the door of Sal's study, and when Sal looked up, he was standing there with his eyes red and swollen. He closed the door behind him. He said he hadn't slept all night. Then he walked to the center of the room, dropped to his knees on the rug, and began to cry. He was very good at crying. He wasn't loud, and he didn't seem false. There were only trembling shoulders, and a voice that broke in exactly the places where it needed to break. He said he hadn't known. He said that through all those years, he'd believed the boy was still alive somewhere, angry with the family and unwilling to come home, and he'd kept telling himself that once the anger faded, Renzo would return. He said he wished someone had opened that envelope. He said that during the entire week Sal had been missing. He'd searched everywhere, called everyone he knew, and hadn't dared contact the police because he was afraid it would affect the family. He said, "Blame me if you want. I deserve to be blamed, but don't think I don't feel this pain." Sal sat in silence and listened to everything. He was a man who had just learned that he carried inside his chest the heart that had killed his father. He was a man who had just discovered that his own younger brother had died 3 winters earlier without his ever knowing. He was a man who desperately wanted to believe that something decent still remained inside that house. So he rose, walked around the desk, and placed one hand on the shoulder of the cousin kneeling on the floor. He told him to get up. He said he wasn't blaming anyone. He only wanted to know the truth. Then he did the one thing he would remember later and never forgive himself for. He told Rocco everything. He said he'd signed a document leaving the heir's name blank, that he was reconsidering the entire matter, that perhaps he wouldn't leave his fortune to someone whose only qualification was the family name, but to someone who truly deserved it, and that the lawyer Meredith Falk was revising the documents for him. Rocco lowered his head, wiped his face, and said Sal could do whatever he wanted, that all he needed was for Sal to remain in that chair. He left the study with the walk of a man who had just been forgiven, and Sal, standing alone beside the window, had no idea that the woman whose name he had just spoken had been working for Rocco since long before Sal had learned how to tie a necktie. That afternoon, he had a car take him to the relief center, this time wearing a proper coat and proper shoes, and he found Willa Marsh stacking boxes of blankets at the far end of the porch. She looked up, studied him from his shoes to the ring on his finger, and recognized him immediately. She didn't appear surprised. She only asked whether he'd gone to be examined. Sal said he hadn't. Then he held out a thick envelope and said it was a small matter, that he wanted her and her daughter to have a decent place to live before the cold fully settled in. Willa looked at the envelope in his hand, but she didn't take it. She stepped back half a pace. She said she'd given him half a loaf of bread. She hadn't sold it to him. Sal stood motionless. In all his years doing the work he did, he'd never met anyone who refused an envelope without attaching some other condition to the refusal. He lowered his hand. He asked what she wanted. Then, Willa said she wanted a job. Not a job created merely for appearances. Not money paid for sitting in an empty chair. But real work, with set hours, a place on the payroll, and her name on official documents she could take to court when they asked how she supported herself. Sal asked what she could do. She was silent for a moment, then said she knew medical supplies. She said she could look at a shipment and know what was missing, which items were nearing expiration, which ones had to be kept cold, and how to maintain the records properly. She didn't say why she knew those things. Sal didn't ask. 3 days later, Willa Marsh's name appeared on the Amato Foundation payroll as the supply coordinator for a mobile clinic that traveled through the 4 poorest neighborhoods in the southern part of the city. Her job was to receive deliveries, count every item, sign for each shipment, and maintain the ledger recording everything that entered and left that vehicle. On her first day, she held the ledger in her hands and felt her fingers tremble slightly, because it had been 3 winters since anyone had entrusted her with something bearing her signature. She had no idea that this very ledger, that exact ledger, would become the thing they used to take away everything she had left. With her first paycheck and an advance from the foundation, Willa was able to rent a room on the 2nd floor of an old row house a few blocks from the relief center. It had 2 windows overlooking the alley, a single-burner electric stove set on top of a cabinet, and a door with a lock. Junie ran around the room 3 times before declaring it the most beautiful home she'd ever lived in. That Saturday afternoon, Sal stopped by to deliver some insurance documents the Foundation's Human Resources Department needed Willa to sign, and as he stood in the doorway preparing to leave, she asked whether he'd eaten dinner. He said he hadn't. She told him to come in, though all she had was noodles. He stepped inside and did something without even noticing it himself. The table in the middle of the room had 2 chairs, one with its back to the door, and the other with its back to the wall. Sal pulled out the chair nearest the wall, turned it slightly so he could see both the entrance and the 2 windows, then sat down. Willa stood at the stove with a fork in her hand, and she saw everything. She asked whether there was a reason he had done that. Sal looked up, and it took him a moment to understand what she meant. He said it was a habit. He said he'd sat that way for 30 years, at every table and in every room, and by now his body did it before his mind had time to think. He offered no further explanation. Willa didn't ask for one. She merely carried 2 bowls of noodles to the table, set them down, then pulled out the remaining chair and sat across from him, in the exact place with its back to the door, without saying a word about what she had just done. Sal looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his fork. The bowl contained nothing but noodles, 1 egg, a few pieces of scallion, and a little of something sprinkled on top that he couldn't identify. He finished everything, including every drop of broth. Junie sat at the corner of the bed eating while she told him about the bus counting game, explaining the rules with great care and saying that he could play, but he would lose because he didn't know which buses carried the people working the night shift. Sal said he would admit defeat in advance. The little girl laughed and said grown people who gave up that quickly were no fun. After Junie had fallen asleep, the 2 adults remained at the table with 2 cups of tea. Willa asked whether he'd gone to be examined. Sal said he had. He said he'd gone because of what she had told him on the sidewalk that day, about the man who had been much younger than he was. He said they had put him through all manner of machines, then kept him there for an afternoon, and now there was a small box, about the size of 2 fingertips inside his chest, placed just beneath his left collarbone, with a wire running inward. He said it had bothered him at first, but he was used to it now. He said the place still ached slightly when the weather turned cold. He told her all of this in the same voice someone might use to talk about replacing a car or repairing a roof, then took a sip of tea and changed the subject by asking whether Junie had found a school. Willa answered that the little girl had returned to school the previous Monday. Then she sat quietly for a while and asked whether he was afraid. Sal set down his cup of tea. He said he'd spent his entire life sitting down to meals with people who were afraid of him. He said he'd once believed that was what he wanted, that if people feared him, he would be safe, and that he'd spent 30 years building himself a dining table where no one dared tell the truth. Then he looked down at the empty bowl before him and said this was the first meal in all those 30 years that had been prepared by someone who wasn't afraid of him. He said he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid that if he died the following week, there wouldn't be a single person in the world who would sit quietly and remember him as a human being. There would only be a crowd of people trying to remember what he had left behind. Willa didn't comfort him. She didn't offer any of the words people usually spoke at moments like that. She merely stood, carried his bowl to the sink, and called back over her shoulder that he should return the following week for more noodles, so he could make it 2 meals. Sal sat in the chair with its back against the wall, inside a room with a single burner stove and a sleeping child, and he couldn't remember the last time anyone had invited him to come back. Every Sunday, the Amato family ate dinner together, and for more years than anyone could count, one chair at that table had remained empty. The chair belonged to Gennaro Amato, Sal's father. It stood at the head of the table near the window, and from the year he died, no one had touched it again. It wasn't because any rule forbade them. No one simply ever did. Extra chairs were brought in when there were too many guests, and people crowded together, but that chair remained empty, and every child who grew up in that house learned the custom without anyone having to teach it. Everyone was present that evening, including several relatives from the maternal side of the family and 2 managers from the transportation company. Nadia sat beside Sal, and Rocco sat across from him. The meal proceeded as usual until halfway through, when Rocco rose to retrieve a bottle of wine from the cabinet. On his way back, he didn't return to his former seat. He walked to the head of the table, pulled out Gennaro's chair, and sat down. He did it slowly and naturally, pouring wine for the person beside him as he settled into the chair, as though it were simply the nearest seat and his legs were tired. The entire table fell silent. No one said anything. The sound of knives and forks stopped for a moment, then resumed more slowly. One of the older women in the family glanced toward Sal. Nadia lowered her eyes to her plate. Sal said nothing. He lifted his glass of water, took a sip, set it down, and watched his cousin remain at the head of the table for the rest of the meal. Not one word was spoken about it, but everyone who sat in that room that night went home carrying the same understanding, that something had just been declared in the middle of dinner, and the declaration was complete. 3 nights later, shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, a black car stopped outside a row house in Kensington, and a man who had just returned from the night shift was invited into the back seat. His name was Petey Vandergrift. He was in his 50s, with thinning hair, and for many years he had been responsible for every letter and document entering and leaving the Amato residence. He was the man who sorted them, carried them upstairs, and threw away whatever wasn't needed. He had left that job long ago. Sal sat beside him in the car without turning to look at him, his eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield. He didn't ask a question. He merely placed a file on Petey's lap. Petey opened it and immediately understood that it was a record of his own life. It contained everything: the loans he hadn't repaid, what he'd done in another state when he was young and had believed was buried forever, and the name and address of the woman with whom he was living. For a long while, Petey couldn't speak. Then Sal asked in a very quiet voice whether someone had paid him to withhold certain letters. Petey began to tremble. He said yes. He said it had happened a very long time ago, that he'd needed the money, and that he'd been given only one simple instruction. Every letter sent from a hospital, a court, or a government agency was to be set aside. He wasn't to deliver it to anyone's room. He was simply to leave it there, and someone would come to collect it. He said he hadn't read them. He swore he'd never opened a single one. Sal asked who had paid him. Petey shook his head. He said he didn't know. He said that each time, there had only been an envelope left inside his desk drawer, with no writing, no name, and no one waiting nearby. He said he'd asked himself that question for years and still didn't know. Sal remained silent for a very long time. Then he reached across, opened the car door on Petey's side, and told him to get out. Petey clutched the file, stumbled onto the sidewalk, and stood watching the car until it turned the corner and disappeared. Inside, Sal sat alone with a truth that had just been confirmed, and no name to place upon it. Someone inside that house had paid to let his younger brother die without anyone knowing, and that person was still sitting down to dinner with him every Sunday. That same week, inside a Russian restaurant on Bustleton Avenue, Rocco Amato sat across from two men whose names never appeared on any document. He talked a great deal. He spoke about a family that had lost its direction, about an older cousin who had aged too quickly and was giving away their entire legacy to strangers, and about how the port would die within a single season if it were left untouched. He said he needed support, nothing more than support. Something solid behind him while he restored order, and in return, he was prepared to surrender control of the southern docks. He made it sound very much like an invitation to become partners. The man on the left, whose white hair was cut close to his scalp, allowed him to finish. Then he tapped one finger against the tabletop twice and said, in the slow English of a man who had no need to speak quickly, that there was one thing Rocco had misunderstood. He said, "We don't go into business with anyone. We buy them out." Rocco laughed and said, yes, that's more or less what I meant." But when he left the restaurant, he stood on the sidewalk for a long while before opening his car door, and inside his mind, there was a very quiet voice he had already decided not to hear. He had signed. He believed he'd just borrowed a knife. He didn't understand that men like them didn't lend anyone a knife. They only lent the handle. 3 weeks later came the annual gala of the Amato Foundation, held in the grand ballroom of an old hotel in the center of the city, with chandeliers, a band, and people dressed in expensive clothes who had come to be photographed beside a sign displaying the amount of money donated. Willa attended because the Human Resources Department had said Foundation employees should be there. She wore the only dark dress she owned, stood near the exit, and planned to leave early. Halfway through the evening, after everyone had taken their seats, Rocco lifted his glass and struck it 3 times. The entire ballroom fell silent. He thanked everyone and thanked the donors, then said that tonight he wanted to introduce a new face of the foundation. His eyes searched the room, and he called Willa's name. She remained still. He called again, this time with a laugh, telling her to come forward and not to be shy. Several people applauded. She walked into the center of the ballroom beneath the lights, and Rocco swept one arm toward her the way someone might gesture toward an object on display. He said this was the woman his entire family had been talking about. The woman who had once sat in line outside a relief center built by this very foundation and whose name now appeared on the foundation's payroll. He spoke in the voice of someone offering praise, and everyone in the ballroom immediately understood that it wasn't praise at all. Soft laughter rose from several tables in the back. A few telephones were lifted into the air. He went on to say that it was a beautiful story, proof that if a person knew how to sit in the right place at the right time, anyone could change their life. Willa stood before 200 people and felt heat rise all the way to the roots of her hair. Then she lifted her head. In a voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, she said she hadn't asked anyone there for anything. She said she'd shared her bread with a hungry man, and if that was considered a crime in this room, then she wanted to ask what all of them were using to build their charitable foundation. No one applauded. No one laughed anymore. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable, and within that silence, Willa turned and walked directly toward the door. She didn't hurry. She didn't run. She walked at an ordinary pace. Sal rose from his table, but by the time he made his way through the crowd, she had already reached the front steps. The first person to look away inside the ballroom that night wasn't Rocco. It was Nadia. She sat at the front table with her glass still in her hand and lowered her eyes to the tablecloth, unable to watch the woman who had just walked out and equally unable to look toward the cousin who had just spoken. She remained that way for a long time, and later, when everything was over, she would always remember that on that night, she could have stood up, and she hadn't. The following Sunday, only 4 people were present at the Amato family dinner. Nadia arrived late and left early. The 2 managers from the transportation company claimed they were busy. That left Sal, Rocco, an aunt from the family, and the longtime housekeeper moving in and out of the kitchen. Sal was in the middle of saying something about settling the final contract at the southern docks when he stopped. He set down his fork. He raised one hand to his chest, just beneath his left collarbone, in the exact place that still ached slightly when the weather turned cold, and spoke a word no one could hear clearly. Then he fell forward, his shoulder striking the edge of the table, before he slid to the floor. The aunt screamed. The housekeeper ran out of the kitchen, saw him lying there, and froze with both hands covering her mouth. Rocco pushed back his chair and stood. He walked around the table slowly and looked down. He didn't kneel. He didn't call Sal's name. He merely stood there with his arms hanging at his sides, staring at the man lying on the floor. Through her sobs, the aunt asked whether anyone had called emergency services. She begged them to call immediately. Rocco said he would do it. He took his telephone from his pocket. Then he didn't dial. He held the telephone in his hand and continued looking down. And as he stood there, his eyes flicked toward the clock hanging on the wall beside the kitchen door. The housekeeper rushed forward, intending to do something, but Rocco raised one hand to stop her and said not to touch him, that they should leave him where he was because moving him now would be dangerous. She stopped. The aunt collapsed into a chair, weeping, and no one in that room was calm enough to realize that the only person who hadn't lost his composure was also the only person who hadn't made a call. The clock on the wall continued to run. Rocco remained standing there. He looked down, then up at the clock, then down again. No one spoke. There was no sound except the aunt's sobbing and the ticking of the second hand. 4 minutes. That was how much time passed between the moment Salvatore Amato fell to the floor and the moment his cousin finally raised the telephone to his ear and gave the address in a voice that had begun to tremble by exactly the right amount. During those 4 minutes, the thing that kept Sal in this world wasn't anyone in that room. It was a small box about the size of 2 fingertips, placed beneath his left collarbone, with a wire running inward. When his heart began to race chaotically and then lost its rhythm, the box recognized what was happening and did the work it had been placed there to do. His body jerked once on the floor, then it jerked again. The housekeeper screamed. Rocco stepped back half a pace, and the heartbeat of the man lying on the floor returned, weak but present. The box hadn't been inside his chest for long. It was there because one afternoon he had gone to be examined. He had gone because of something said on a cold sidewalk by a woman he didn't know. A woman who had placed 2 fingers against his wrist without asking permission, counted 3 times, frowned, and told him there was a skip in his heartbeat. In that entire city, among all the people who ate with him, worked for him, and feared him, not one person had looked at him long enough to notice it. There had been only one, and she was sitting in a room with a single burner stove a few blocks away, checking her daughter's schoolwork, completely unaware that the half loaf of bread she'd given away that day had just done something far greater than keep a hungry man from starving. The ambulance arrived. They took Sal away. Rocco went with him, sitting in the front seat, and on the way to the hospital, he made 3 telephone calls, none of them to a member of the family. And on the ceiling of that dining room, mounted in a hidden corner behind the decorative molding, there was a small camera that Wendell Pruitt had installed with his own hands many years earlier, along with the rest of the security system in the house, and it had recorded steadily from beginning to end, without missing a single second of those 4 minutes. Sal lay in intensive care and didn't regain consciousness. In the house without him, everything moved very quickly. 4 days after that night, Rocco placed a stack of documents in front of Nadia and said it was a matter of procedure. He said the foundation had discovered discrepancies in the supply records for the mobile clinic, and under the regulations, the foundation was required to submit a report to the licensing board. Failing to report it would be the real violation. He told her to sign where it called for a representative of the family, that it was only administrative paperwork, and that the sooner she signed, the sooner the court would have grounds to consider Sal's condition. If they simply left him lying there without anyone stepping forward, the entire household would remain frozen. Nadia was exhausted, frightened, and convinced that her brother was about to die. She turned through the first few pages, saw nothing but language about procedures and supply codes, then signed. She didn't read the final page. If she had, she would have seen that the document didn't merely report a discrepancy. It identified one person by name, listed her position and the identification number of the vehicle, and used the words diversion of controlled substances. Those words, once placed in the hands of the licensing board, weren't administrative paperwork. They were a switch. What neither Nadia nor most of the people involved knew was that the vehicle's ledger had been altered weeks earlier. Someone had added records of distributions that had never taken place on days when Willa was on duty. and beneath every entry was a signature forged in the likeness of her handwriting, close enough that anyone giving it only a passing glance wouldn't suspect a thing. Willa received the first call from the board on a Tuesday morning. She answered every question clearly, provided dates and times, named the people who had worked the same shifts, and repeated again and again that the signatures beside those entries weren't hers. The person on the other end recorded everything in a courteous voice and said the case had been referred to investigators. Willa put down the telephone and sat motionless for a very long time in the room with the single-burner stove. She understood what was coming. She had once stood on the other side of calls like that. She knew how quickly the process moved when the words "controlled substances" appeared in a file, and she knew exactly where a woman, without a lawyer, without anyone to post bail, and with a history of a suspended license stood inside that process. So she did what she'd learned to do during the years she had spent living in 7 different homes, the thing a child who had grown up as she had never forgot. She prepared in advance. That afternoon, she went to see Mrs. Vera. The 2 women sat in the small office behind the center, and Willa told her what she needed. Mrs. Vera didn't ask many questions. She took out a temporary caregiving authorization form, and the 2 of them completed it and had it notarized that same afternoon. Mrs. Vera said she already had 3 grandchildren staying with her for the summer, and 1 more child would only make the house happier. The following morning, Willa folded her daughter's clothes into a bag, added the drawing pad and box of crayons, and made everything seem perfectly ordinary. She brushed Junie's hair, retied the ribbon that had come loose, and said she was going to spend a few days at Mrs. Vera's house, where there were 3 other children, and even a backyard where she could run. Junie asked where her mother was going. Willa said she had to take care of paperwork, and grown people's paperwork took forever and was terribly boring. Junie asked whether her mother would remember to bring drawing paper for herself, too. Willa smiled and said she was terrible at drawing, so Junie could draw for her instead. The little girl wrapped both arms tightly around her mother's waist, then ran to Mrs. Vera's car, climbed into the back seat, and waved through the window until the car turned out of the alley. Willa stood on the sidewalk and waved back until she could no longer see it. Then she returned inside, washed the 2 bowls in the sink, folded the blanket on the bed, placed the key on the table, and sat down to wait. They came that afternoon, 2 people who were polite and read her rights to her. She stood, put on her coat, and walked to the door with them without having to say goodbye to anyone, because by then, there was no one left inside the room. The holding cell had 4 pale blue walls, a bench fixed to one of them, and a light that never went out. They took her fingerprints, asked whether she needed to call anyone, and Willa thought for a while before saying no. She had no one to call. The attorney appointed to represent her would arrive the following morning. She sat on the bench, rested her back against the wall, and kept her spine straight. Beyond the door came the sounds of metal gates, footsteps, and voices calling back and forth along the corridor. She heard everything, and heard nothing at all. It was cold, and she pulled her coat tightly around herself. When she slipped one hand into her pocket, her fingers touched something. She took it out. It was a small bundle of paper napkins, awkwardly folded, the corners crumpled from having been pushed inside in a hurry. She opened it. Inside was half a sandwich, cut with a table knife, its crust already slightly dry, made with the same kind of white bread Mrs. Vera always gave her grandchildren to take to school. Willa sat staring at it. Then she remembered. That morning, while Willa was brushing her hair and retightening her ribbon, Junie had stood beside her lunchbox for a while. The little girl hadn't said anything. She had simply cut her sandwich in half, wrapped one piece, and slipped it into her mother's coat pocket, while Willa turned away to retrieve the bag of clothes. She hadn't called attention to it. She hadn't said, "Mama, I left this for you." She had merely done it, then run to the car and waved through the window. Willa held the bundle of napkins in both hands and bowed her head. She had grown up in 7 different homes. She had learned very early never to keep more than she could carry by herself, how to fold her clothes neatly so she could leave at any moment, and how not to become too attached to anyone. In all those homes, not one person had ever divided their own food in half and left a portion for her. She sat on the bench inside the room where the light never went out and cried without making a sound, her shoulders trembling, one hand covering her mouth while the other continued clutching the bundle of napkins. She cried for a long time. Then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat and sat upright again. She didn't think about the sentence she might receive. She didn't think about the licensing board, the forged signatures, or the person who had done this to her. though she knew she would eventually have to think about all of those things. The only thing in her mind at that moment was Junie's school performance at the end of the month. The little girl had been practicing for weeks, standing in the middle of the room and singing the same song over and over about birds flying south. There was one part she always sang incorrectly, and whenever she made the mistake, she turned to her mother so Willa could sing it properly for her again. Her teacher had sent a note home, reminding parents to arrive early because the auditorium was small, and anyone who couldn't find a seat would have to stand. Willa counted the days in her head. She began with today. She tried to calculate how long an investigation usually took and when the first hearing might be held, and she realized that she didn't know. That was what frightened her, not the 4 pale blue walls. She didn't know whether she would make it home in time, and she had promised her daughter she would sit in the front row. She carefully wrapped the half sandwich again, smoothing every crease in the napkins, and placed it back inside her coat pocket. She didn't eat it. She lay down on the bench, turned her face toward the wall, and kept one hand resting over that pocket throughout the night. That night, inside the hospital room, Salvatore Amato regained consciousness before anyone realized it. He didn't open his eyes. He lay still, breathing evenly, and listened. 2 people were standing at the foot of his bed. Meredith Falk spoke very softly and precisely, using the same voice she always used when reading contractual terms. She said the original record of the competency evaluation no longer existed, that she had told the court the evaluation had never been completed because her client had abandoned it halfway through, and that the video showed nothing more than a man sitting and talking inside a room. Without a notarized signature attached to it, the recording proved nothing. She said the guardianship petition had been filed, and temporary authority had already taken effect, which meant that from now until the hearing, not $1 held in his name could be touched, and not one signature he made would carry legal validity. The second voice asked about the foundation. Mrs. Falk said the foundation stood outside the rest of the estate. He had separated it with his own hands, and now not even he could withdraw a single cent from it. Then the 2 of them left. Sal lay in the darkness, with his eyes still closed, and understood that the 3 locks he had fastened with his own hands in the back room of the bakery that night had now closed around his own wrists. The following morning, when the day nurse came in to measure his blood pressure, he opened his eyes and was able to speak. They summoned the doctor and called the family, and the sound of running footsteps filled the corridor. The first question he asked wasn't about himself. He asked where Willa was. No one could answer him. It wasn't until noon that someone finally dared tell him. He listened to everything without speaking, then asked for a telephone. He called 3 people, and all 3 told him the same thing in different ways, that his assets had been frozen, that until the court issued a ruling, no one would dare accept his signature, and that if he attempted to post bail using property under dispute, the petition would be rejected that same day. Sal put down the telephone. A man who owned 2 companies, a port, and a foundation bearing his family's name lay in a hospital bed, unable to spend a single dollar to release one woman from a holding cell. He had spent 30 years building a system that only he could unlock, and now he realized that the system had never belonged to him. It had merely been waiting for him to fall, so it could change owners. While he lay there, another woman was doing what he couldn't. Mrs. Vera Lindqvist took the bus to the center early that morning, opened the filing cabinet, and began removing one item after another. There was the center's handwritten attendance ledger, recording who arrived each day, who left, who stayed overnight, and bearing the signature of the staff member on duty. There were the center's retained inventory forms for the mobile clinic, the working copies no one at the foundation had considered because they were kept only for comparison, and on every one of them, Willa's signature appeared beside the delivery workers. Day after day, her handwriting steady and consistent. There was a letter from Junie's teacher confirming that the little girl attended school regularly and that her mother brought her and picked her up. There were timesheets. There was a list of volunteers bearing Willa's name. Mrs. Vera placed everything inside a large envelope, carried it to the appointed attorney's office, waited in the corridor for the entire morning, and when she was finally called inside, she placed the envelope on the desk and said, "I don't know the law, but I know how to keep records, and everything that woman has done throughout all these months is in here." There was no expensive lawyer. No one called anyone with influence. There was only a set of documents that had been properly preserved, a system willing to sit down and read them, and a judge who needed less than half a day to finish reviewing them before granting Willa release while the investigation continued. That afternoon, Willa walked through the door, still wearing the coat with the bundle of paper napkins inside its pocket, and Mrs. Vera stood waiting on the steps with a cup of hot coffee. A few days later, after Sal was strong enough to sit upright, Mrs. Vera came to the hospital. She sat in the chair beside his bed, placed her handbag on her lap, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Then he asked her a question he had carried in his mind for a long time. He asked whether, during the 7 days he had stood in line for soup at her center, she had recognized him from the very beginning. Mrs. Vera said she had. He asked why she hadn't said anything. Mrs. Vera looked out the window for a moment, then turned back to him. She said anyone who came to her door was simply a hungry person. She said, "I don't keep 2 kinds of soup." On the day Sal was brought home, Wendell Pruitt waited for him at the foot of the stairs with his hands twisting together, and said there was something he had to tell him, something he'd intended to carry to his grave, but could no longer keep buried. The 2 men went into the study. The old man sat on the edge of a chair, his back as straight as it had been in the days when he still struck a punching bag, and he began at the farthest point in the story. He said that in the year Renzo turned 19, the lady of the house had summoned him upstairs one night. She gave him an envelope and a car key, and said, "Wendell, take him away for me. Take him anywhere, as long as he's out of this city before dawn." She said they were preparing to give Renzo his first assignment, and once he completed that first assignment, there would be no turning back. She didn't want her boy sitting at that dining table. Wendell said he had driven all night. The boy sat in the back seat clutching a cloth bag without saying a word, and when the car reached the highway, he turned and looked back at the house once. Only once. Wendell left him at a bus station in another state just as dawn was beginning to break, and Renzo shook his hand, thanked him, and walked away. Wendell returned, told the lady of the house it was done, and from that day forward, no one in the family spoke Renzo's name again. The lady died several years later. Then Wendell fell silent for a long time. He said there was something else. He said that on a Christmas night many winters ago, he had been on duty in the guardhouse when someone approached the gate on foot. The night was bitterly cold, and the man wore only a thin coat. When he stepped into the light, Wendell recognized him immediately, even though he was fully grown, much thinner, and had a beard. Renzo stood at the gate and rang the bell. Wendell was about to run outside when he saw the front door open, and the person who answered it was Rocco. The 2 men spoke on the steps beneath the light. Wendell couldn't hear everything, but he heard Renzo ask whether his brother was home. He heard those words very clearly. Then Rocco gave him a short answer that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and Wendell watched Renzo stand perfectly still, then nod, turn around, and walk away. He followed the fence, passing the guardhouse, and Wendell had risen and raised one hand to knock on the glass, but Renzo's head was lowered. He was walking too quickly. Wendell was already old, and the guardhouse door was jammed. By the time he managed to open it, Renzo had reached the end of the street. Wendell said he later asked Rocco who had come to the house. Rocco told him it had been a man looking for work. It was many years before Wendell learned what had been said during those 10 seconds, because one night, while Rocco was drinking, Wendell heard him tell someone that his younger cousin had once come crawling home, and that Rocco had told him plainly that his brother had ordered him never to return. When Wendell finished, he sat in silence. Then the old man's shoulders began to shake. He raised one broad hand to cover his face and wept with the dry, awkward sobs of a man who had never cried in front of anyone in his life. He said, "It was my fault. I stood inside that guardhouse and watched the boy I once drove away in the middle of the night turn his back on his home for the 2nd time, and I didn't call him back in time." Sal couldn't speak. He sat there with one hand resting on the old man's shoulder, and there was only one image inside his mind: his younger brother standing outside the gate on Christmas night, only a few dozen steps away from him, asking whether his brother was home, and being told that he wasn't. That night, Wendell went to do what had to be done. He was the man who had installed the entire camera system in that house many years earlier. He knew every recorder, every hard drive, and every hidden corner behind the molding along the ceiling. He sat in the technical room until nearly dawn, his hands trembling with age, and copied everything that needed to be preserved onto a memory card, including that Sunday dinner and all 4 minutes during which Rocco had stood watching the clock. Wendell placed the memory card inside his breast pocket, but having built the house's security network with his own hands, the old man was one step ahead. Before leaving the technical room, he had already uploaded an encrypted copy of the video to a secure cloud drive and stored a secondary backup. The following morning, He crossed the courtyard and found Rocco waiting at the end of the corridor with his hands in his pockets and a brilliant smile on his face. He said, "Wendell, I heard you spent a very long time in the technical room last night." He held out his hand. The old man stood motionless, playing the part of a defeated servant, and surrendered the physical memory card. Rocco took it, inserted it into a computer right there in front of Wendell, and deleted every file one at a time until the screen was blank. Rocco walked away smiling, completely unaware that he had only erased a decoy copy, while the true evidence was already safely in Sal's hands. It took Sal 4 days to find the man who had held the pen. He didn't do it with money, because his money remained locked away, but with the one thing he still possessed, the knowledge of whom to question and when to ask. The man's name was Curtis Mundy. He worked in the Foundation's warehouse division, was still young, had a wife, and carried a gambling debt no one in his family knew about. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, a black car stopped outside a row house in Fishtown, and Curtis was invited into the back seat. Sal didn't turn toward him. He didn't ask a single question. He merely placed a file on the man's lap. Curtis opened it and found his entire life inside. The debts, the names of his lenders, the amounts, the dates and times. Even the night he had remained alone in the warehouse, with the ledger open before him and a pen that didn't belong to him. Curtis began to talk, speaking very quickly. He said someone had given him several sheets bearing samples of the handwriting, that he'd only copied them, that he'd believed it was an internal matter, and thought they were merely trying to frighten someone. He hadn't known they would take it so far that someone would be arrested. The moment he said those words, he fell silent, because he'd heard what had just come out of his own mouth. Sal continued staring through the windshield. In a very quiet voice, he said that a 6-year-old child had been staying in someone else's home for the past several days, while her mother had spent a night inside a holding cell because of the lines Curtis had copied. He said, "Do you know what the worst part is? You still have a way out of this, but she doesn't, because she never did anything that she should have to find a way out of." Then he reached across and opened the car door beside Curtis. He told him to get out. He said, "I'm giving you what you didn't give that little girl, a way out. You can use it by going to the authorities and telling them exactly what you just told me, or you can use it to run, but I want you to know that I won't chase you, because I don't do that kind of work anymore." Curtis Mundy stepped onto the sidewalk, clutching the file, and stood there in the cold without moving for a very long time. But the testimony of a man who had just admitted to falsifying records was worth no more than the man's own credibility. And both Sal and his lawyer knew it. They needed something else, something no one could alter, and for 3 days, no one could think of what it might be. Willa was the one who found it. That afternoon, she was sitting in Mrs. Vera's kitchen, reconstructing from memory every day on which she had received a delivery. And when she reached the part describing the rear lot where the mobile clinic always parked to unload its supplies, she stopped writing. She looked up and asked Mrs. Vera whether the camera mounted on the wall beside the warehouse door was still operating. Mrs. Vera said it was. It ran constantly and had never been turned off. Willa asked where the footage was stored. Mrs. Vera said it was stored online through some service that charged a monthly fee, and the Foundation paid the bill because the center certainly couldn't afford it. Willa set down her pen. She remembered that camera very clearly because she'd stood directly beneath it more times than she could count. Whenever the vehicle arrived, she stood in that exact place, with the ledger tucked against her elbow, counted the boxes, then signed. She had stood beneath it in the rain, beneath it in the sun, and beneath it on early mornings, when her breath still turned to mist in the air. Every time she signed, that lens had been looking down at her. That meant every legitimate entry in the ledger had a corresponding piece of footage, while every fabricated entry had nothing at all. Mrs. Vera rose and retrieved the service bill. It contained the account name and the registered email address, which belonged to the center itself. Mrs. Vera had created it on the center's first day, and she had written the password inside a notebook kept in the kitchen desk drawer. No one at the Foundation had ever asked about it. No one in the Amato family had ever thought of it. Rocco had erased everything the old guard had managed to copy and controlled every hard drive inside the great house, but never once in his life had he lowered himself enough to ask for the password to a homeless shelter. The footage stored online proved which days the vehicle had arrived, but it couldn't prove what had been inside the boxes, and the lawyer said they needed to compare it with the original warehouse intake forms, which were still kept in the donated medical supplies warehouse near the southern docks. Willa went there on a Thursday morning with a letter of authorization from the foundation. Her name was entered in the visitor registry. She signed where she was supposed to sign, and the guard at the gate called to verify her authorization before raising the barrier. She didn't sneak inside. She walked directly through the front entrance in broad daylight. The donated supplies warehouse stood at the end of a row of low buildings, and the records were stored inside the cold room because it also contained cabinets holding medicine that had to be kept at a controlled temperature, and someone had conveniently placed the filing shelves in the same space. Willa put on a heavy coat, pushed open the weighty steel door, and stepped inside. She worked very quickly. She knew exactly what she needed. She pulled out the bundle of original intake forms, turned to the correct months, propped the pages upright against the shelf, and photographed each one with her telephone. When she finished, she checked every image to make certain it was clear, then sent them. She sent them to the lawyer, to Mrs. Vera, and to her own email account, 3 destinations through 3 separate routes. Only after she saw the confirmation that they had been sent did she place the telephone inside her pocket. At that exact moment, a short alarm sounded. The lights in the ceiling changed to yellow, and the steel door behind her began to move. She turned, ran toward it, and tried to stop it with her hand. But the door of a cold storage room wasn't the kind that could be held open by hand. Once activated, it completed its cycle. She pounded on the door and called out. No one answered from the other side. On the control panel mounted inside the room, there was only a small red light and a message stating that the lock was being controlled remotely. Willa stood motionless for several seconds. Then she did what someone who had worked night shifts in an intensive care unit would do. She sat down, drew her body into a corner beyond the direct current of cold air, pulled up the collar of her coat, and began to calculate. She took out her telephone. It still showed a signal. She called. Sal answered on the second ring. She told him briefly where she was and what had happened to the door, then added one more thing, that the photographs had already been sent to 3 places, and that he should tell the lawyer to open her inbox and look at them. She said that first, before she even told him she was cold. Sal rose from his chair in the study, and immediately understood what her words meant. No matter what happened inside that room, the records had already made it outside, the case would remain intact, and the person behind all of this would still lose. It meant there was nothing else he needed to preserve. Half an hour later, he reached the docks. The control room was on the 2nd floor of a sheet metal building, and 3 men were seated inside, including one with closely cropped white hair whom Sal had heard described before. No one stood. No one pointed a weapon at anyone. The white-haired man merely tilted his chin toward the camera screen showing the interior of the cold room, where a woman sat huddled in a corner, and said the door could be opened. It was a small matter. There had simply been a few technical difficulties over the past several days. Then he named the price. It wasn't money. Sal's money had been frozen, and they knew it. What they wanted was the access code to the family's master account system, something only one person in the world knew, something that remained the doorway to everything the Amato family had accumulated over 40 years, even while the court kept the assets frozen. The white-haired man told him to take his time. There was plenty of it, and it wasn't very cold in there yet. Sal stood motionless. He knew perfectly well that he didn't have to remain there. He knew the evidence capable of bringing Rocco down had been resting safely inside 3 different email accounts for half an hour. He knew that if he turned his back and walked out of that room, he would still win his battle and preserve everything he and his father had built since the days when the neighborhood still had no streetlights. He knew all of this clearly, without the slightest uncertainty. He stepped toward the table, pulled the piece of paper in front of him, and wrote down the code. Then he pushed it across the tabletop and said, "Open the door." The white-haired man picked up the paper, examined it, then nodded to the man beside him. On the screen, the steel door began moving in the opposite direction. Sal descended the stairs and crossed the yard, reaching the doorway the second it opened. Willa collapsed forward into his arms, her skin ice-cold, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. Sal immediately wrapped his heavy coat around her, holding her steady as her body shivered uncontrollably from the onset of hypothermia. She looked up weakly, managed to whisper, asking what he had given up, but the bone-chilling cold overwhelmed her before she could say another word. On the final Sunday of the month, Rocco Amato hosted a large dinner in the family home, inviting relatives from near and far, several partners from the transportation company, 2 members of the council, and the lawyer Meredith Falk. He sat at the head of the table near the window, in the chair he hadn't relinquished since the day he first claimed it. After the main course had been served, he rose with a glass in his hand and began talking about the family's need for someone to step forward, about how his cousin was weak and no one knew when he might recover, about the approaching court hearing, and about the changes that had to be made if they were to keep everything from collapsing. He was halfway through his speech when the great door at the far end of the room opened. Salvatore Amato walked in under his own power, without anyone supporting him. Willa Marsh was on his right. 1 pace behind them, moving more slowly, came Wendell Pruitt, the old gatekeeper, carrying a slim case. The entire table fell silent. Rocco remained standing with the glass in his hand, and the smile still fixed on his face. Sal walked directly to the head of the table, without looking at anyone. He picked up a glass, placed it in front of Rocco, and turned it halfway around. Not one person spoke. The 2 men stationed at the entrance stepped outside and closed the door behind them. The aunt sitting nearby lowered her fork. There were people in that room who had been eating at that table since childhood, and every one of them understood exactly what had just happened. Wendell opened the case, removed a laptop, and connected it to the large screen mounted on the wall, the one normally used to display family photographs during holidays. Sal told the room that on the night he collapsed, someone had stood watching him lie on this very floor, and he wanted everyone to see what that person had done. The recording began to play. There was no sound, only images. Everyone watched the room in which they were now sitting appear on the screen. They saw a man collapse. They saw the aunt spring to her feet. They saw the housekeeper rush forward and then be stopped. Then they saw Rocco standing there, standing and looking down, taking out his telephone, not dialing, raising his eyes to the clock on the wall, looking down again, looking back at the clock. The recording wasn't cut or accelerated, and the horror lay in the fact that it simply kept going. Someone in the room began to turn away. One member of the council pushed his chair back. The aunt covered her mouth with both hands and began to cry, because she had been in the room that night and only now understood what she had been sitting in the middle of. By the time Rocco finally raised the telephone to his ear on the screen, no one at the table was looking toward him anymore. Rocco set down his glass. He said he'd been panicking, that everyone had been panicking, and that anyone who had never found himself in that situation had no right to judge. He said the recording proved nothing, that anyone could be overcome with fear and stand frozen for a few minutes. His voice grew louder, and the louder it became, the fewer people looked at him. At that moment, Nadia Amato rose from the middle of the table. She stood slowly, her hands trembling, opened her handbag, and removed a thin set of papers inside a plastic sleeve. She walked around the table, placed it in front of her brother, then turned toward Meredith Falk and pushed it slightly in her direction so she could see it clearly. It was a certified copy of the competency evaluation, complete and bearing the notary's signature on the final page. The document Mrs. Falk had told the court had never existed. Nadia said that on the night of the gala, her brother had thrust it into her hands in the corridor and told her to hide it, to tell no one, and that if anything happened, she would know what to do. She said she'd carried it in her bag every day since then. She said she'd sat inside the car on the day they came to take Willa away, and she hadn't opened the door. She said, "I'm sorry it took me this many days to find the courage," and her voice broke on the final word. Meredith Falk stared at the papers on the table, and for the first time in many years, she couldn't hold any expression in place. Rocco turned toward Sal's younger sister and opened his mouth, but not a single word came out. After all the guests had left and the only sound remaining in the house was that of people clearing the table in the next room, Sal invited Willa into his study and closed the door. He didn't turn on the main light. There was only the lamp on his desk. He said there was something he wanted her to see, then walked to the desk, opened a drawer, and removed an envelope that had faded to a pale yellow. He placed it in front of her. Willa picked it up. She looked at the front and said nothing. She turned it over. Then she lowered it onto the desk very slowly, as though it weighed far more than a piece of paper. She said, "This is my handwriting." Sal stood on the other side of the desk, and at first, he didn't understand. He asked what she meant. Willa opened the envelope, took out the letter, unfolded it, and read over the first few lines before stopping. She said, "I wrote this. I sat in the staff break room and wrote it after my shift because I found this address in his coat pocket, and I couldn't find a telephone number anywhere." She said she'd mailed the letter and waited, but no one had responded, and eventually she'd believed his family simply wanted nothing to do with him. Sal placed both hands on the desk. He asked whether she remembered that night. Willa said she remembered every minute of it. She told him Renzo had been brought in near dawn, with no identification, and no one accompanying him, and everyone had understood from the beginning that his chances were poor. She said they had done everything they could, and during the time when he was still conscious, she had been the one sitting beside him. She said he hadn't been afraid. He had only been tired. She said he'd asked whether anyone there had called his family, then answered his own question by saying they shouldn't bother. Then Willa fell silent for a very long time. She said, "There's something else I've carried for 3 winters, and I never knew whom to tell." Near the end, he took my hand, and he said this to me: "If anyone asks, please tell them I didn't stay away because I was angry. I stayed away because I was afraid I really would go back." There wasn't a sound inside the study. Sal stood motionless, both hands resting on the desk, as Willa watched his shoulders begin to collapse. He raised one hand to grip the edge of the desk, then the other, and his legs gave way beneath him. He sank onto the carpet with his back against the leg of the desk, and a sound broke from him unlike anything she had ever heard from a man. It wasn't crying. It was the sound of something inside him being broken apart. Willa walked around the desk, knelt beside him, and didn't say a word. She merely placed one hand on his shoulder and left it there. He managed to speak a few broken phrases. He said Renzo had stood outside the gate of his home. He had walked there on Christmas night and asked only one question. He said he was afraid he really would come back. He was afraid of himself. "I spent my entire life building a house that made my brother afraid of himself if he stepped inside. I had money. I had people. I could find a man hiding from a debt across 3 states in 2 days. And I never once went looking for my own brother." Willa lowered herself fully onto the carpet beside him. She told him Renzo hadn't been lying there alone. She said someone had held his hand. Someone had known his name. And he had managed to leave a message for his brother, something not everyone was given the chance to do. Sal raised his eyes to her. He looked at her for a very long time, with the gaze of a man trying to fit together 2 pieces of the same picture that had only now finally been placed beside each other. That letter had made him remove his ring and walk into the street at 4 o'clock in the morning. Those 6 nights on the street had led him to one particular porch, one cold step, and one woman who had divided her last portion of food in half. Neither of them spoke those words aloud. They simply sat beside each other on the carpet, in a room lit by a single desk lamp. 2 strangers who had both accompanied the same man through his final departure, each standing at one end of the same story, and only now discovering it. Rocco waited for 3 days inside the room where they had temporarily confined him, and he waited in the way a man raised in that house had always been taught to wait. He believed he knew what was coming. He imagined there would be a car, a journey, and some place far from other people, and inside him was something almost like relief, because that was an ending he understood. That ending had rules, and a man who died according to the rules of the family would at least still have his name spoken at the dinner table. But the car never came. On the 4th day, Sal summoned him to the study. A thick file lay on the desk, and 2 people were already waiting. One was Sal's new lawyer, and the other was an investigator from the federal prosecutor's office. Sal told Rocco that his entire share of the legitimate assets would remain untouched, and that he had the right to hire the best defense attorney that money could buy. Then he said that everything else, the recording, the altered ledger, the testimony of the man who had forged the handwriting, the documents concerning the guardianship petition, and the competency evaluation that someone had sworn never existed, had all been sitting on the prosecutor's desk since that morning. Rocco gave a dry laugh and said, "You don't have the courage to do it with your own hands, so you're turning me over to the government." Sal said, "No, you wanted the table. I'm giving you a table in a visitation room. Our family has judged its own in darkness for 40 years, and you'll be the first to be tried in the light, with a judge, a lawyer, a court reporter, and the right to say everything you want to say." Rocco stood motionless for a long time. Then he spoke the only honest words he'd said in years. He asked, "Do you know where my father died?" He said his father had taken the blame for everything so Uncle Gennaro could return home for dinner, and they had promised to look after his wife and child. What looking after them meant was taking Rocco once a month to sit with his father for 40 minutes at a long table with a painted line down the middle. He said, "You grew up at the dinner table in your house. I grew up at that table. You were given the family name. I was given the bill." No one in the room spoke. There was truth in those words, and everyone sitting there could hear it. But everyone in that room also remembered a ledger with false entries added to it. A woman who had spent a night inside a holding cell, and a child who had been sent to stay at someone else's home for several days, so she wouldn't have to witness what was happening. A miserable childhood could explain what a person became, but it couldn't restore what that person had taken from others. Sal sat with the prosecutor through 2 full sessions and told them everything, including the parts that would leave him with nothing, including the account code he'd written on a piece of paper inside the control room at the docks. The money couldn't be recovered, and he had known that from the moment he picked up the pen. He left the final session as a man with nothing remaining in his name, while the Amato Foundation remained intact because he had separated it from himself with his own hands in the back room of the bakery on the night when all of them had believed he was losing his mind. Nadia was prosecuted in the same round. The person who wrote a petition asking the court to show her leniency wasn't her brother. It was Willa. She spent an entire evening writing it, and nowhere in the petition did she say that she forgave Nadia. She merely explained that this woman had signed a document she hadn't finished reading while believing that her brother was about to die, that this same woman had later risen by herself in the middle of a crowded dinner table, and that if the court took away her chance as well, no one would benefit. Willa told Sal she hadn't done it for Nadia. She had done it because she'd spent enough of her life inside a system that knew only how to take things away, and she didn't want to become another link in that chain. On the morning the relief center reopened after its roof had been repaired, Sal removed the ring from his finger, the last thing remaining from his former life, and placed it inside the donation box beside the door, without telling anyone or allowing anyone to take a photograph. Mrs. Vera saw him, but she said nothing. She simply closed the lid of the box. On the day Willa brought her daughter home, Junie ran all the way to the entrance of the alley and threw her arms around her mother. Then she pulled a thick stack of paper from her backpack. She said, "I drew them ahead of time, Mama." She showed her mother every page. Each one depicted a brown-haired woman wearing a white uniform. In one picture, she stood beside a hospital bed. In another, she held a baby. In another, she stood in front of a vehicle bearing a cross. Junie said Mrs. Vera had told her that if she drew something beforehand, it would come true. Willa sat down on the sidewalk, gathered her daughter into her arms, and for a long time, she couldn't speak. That spring, the porch in front of Amato's restaurant became a breakfast distribution point operated by the foundation. It opened at 6 o'clock, and anyone passing by was welcome to stop. One morning, Willa carried out a loaf of bread still warm from the oven and handed it to the man sitting on the steps. He accepted it, broke it in half, and gave the larger portion back to her. Junie sat beside them, with her legs swinging, and asked, "Were you really hungry back then?" Sal looked down at the bread in his hand. He said, "I've been hungry my entire life, sweetheart. I just didn't know what I was hungry for." This story leaves us with one very simple lesson. A person's worth isn't measured by what they possess, but by what they are willing to share when they have almost nothing left. What saves another person often isn't a miracle. Sometimes it is someone willing to sit down and keep careful records, someone willing to listen, and someone willing to look at us long enough to see that something isn't right. And the greatest cost of wealth comes when we look at another human being and see nothing but something to step over. Let us live in such a way that when someone knocks on the door of the home we have built, no one is afraid to step inside. If today's story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about the story of Salvatore and Willa? Which part moved you most deeply? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely look forward to hearing the feelings that come from the depths of your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.